joining us for today's very important conversation, Philanthropy California RBC Global Impact Investing Series program. So as I know you know, but I just always like to mention, Philanthropy California is actually one of the nation's largest collaborations of grant makers, as it includes the entire networks of Northern California grant makers, Southern California grant makers, and San Diego grant makers. And we believe firmly that through collaboration and shared learning through peers, that we can together build a better future for California. Today, we're building on our previous event in the series and going deeper into the practice of impact investing, where we're going to focus on portfolio activation. So for those of you who are just learning about portfolio activation, the idea is that philanthropists go beyond using only their dollars assigned to grant making and work some or all of their corpus to align capital with mission. It's a big, audacious undertaking, and there's no one right way to do it. Today, we have the privilege of being able to learn deeply from your peers who've been thinking very deeply about this question. Today, we're joined by Mike Dorsey of the Sandhill Foundation from Northern California, Rochelle Witherana from the California Wellness Foundation from Southern California, and Jeremy Pearl, the Jewish Community Foundation of San Diego. And our conversation guide today is Tina Castro of Avivar Capital. But before we kick things off, please allow me to introduce one of our key partners in this initiative and my very dear friend, Catherine Bernat from RBC Global. Catherine.
Thank you, Debbie. No, we're in a very serious time, but I am inclined to say meeting Debbie has brought back my faith and love at first sight. She has just been an incredible partner, and her energy has spread across the RBC organization, as well as in San Diego and up and down California coast. So it's a privilege to be here. And on behalf of RBC Global Asset Management, I want to thank all of you for being here today. At RBC, we believe in the power of harnessing market forces to impact the issues that we all care about the most. From climate change to homelessness to COVID recovery and a long, long list of other things. My colleagues and I at RBC believe in the power of innovation to have our money work smarter to align with our values. And as Debbie says, to think beyond the grant-making dollars that are available to an organization into the entire corpus. We recognize that one of the most powerful ways to innovate is to create durable change through collaboration. In fact, we're proud to let you know that in partnership with Philanthropy California, earlier this month, we launched Philanthropy California Investment Collaborative with $100 million of investments in California. And just in case you think that nobody cares, we appeared in the Financial Times this week. I'm going to turn this way to hopefully open up my quote for that, which of course, just in time has disappeared. We reported that RBC Global Asset Management has launched a $100 million fixed income fund to provide loans to home buyers and small businesses in California. That we are proud that we can tell every investor, we say, that every dollar of every loan that comprises every security in your portfolio can be tracked, and you can see who gets the dollars and what they are for. And we can absolutely guarantee everyone that every dollar is going to California. Just so you know, thanks to the Philanthropy California effort, I actually got notice this week in our London office. So I'm feeling very special, thanks to you. So the goal of the collaborative is to take a coordinated approach to earning a direct competitive market rate of return with a specific targeted concern, particularly underserved communities and families in California. We're here today to continue to build that support and the collaborative conversations and actions that can grow with some of the best and brightest foundations in the state to talk about the subject that is near to mine and really everyone, I assume, on this call's Heart portfolio activation. And without further ado, I'd like to pass the mantle to the fabulous moderator from Avivar Capital, Tina Castro.
Thank you, Catherine. So it's a pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon, and I'm looking forward to diving into this important conversation about portfolio activation. And maybe just to take a moment before we dive in to frame it up, I would like to highlight that really we're going to be talking about activating the whole portfolio, principally the market rate portion of the portfolio, and not so much focused on program-related investments, just so folks can sort of situate their thinking a little bit about that. So as Catherine said, I am Tina Castro. I'm managing partner and co-founder with Avivar Capital. We are an SEC registered investment advisor, and we focus solely on impact investing. So these are conversations that we love to have and folks that we'd love to have them with. So I have the privilege of getting to moderate today and guiding the conversation with our three distinguished panelists. And I'm going to kick it off by asking each of you to introduce yourselves. And if you would, in the course of that introduction, it would be great if you could say a word about the work that your organization is doing in this space, and also how you went about developing the capacity to take it all on. And then we'll move on from there. And maybe we could start with Rochelle.
Great. Thanks so much, Tina. Good afternoon, everybody. I am really happy to be here to share a little bit about our mission-related investing journey here at the California Wellness Foundation. Our MRI journey really began back in 2016 with a research strategy development and a learning phase. We embarked on a 2-year board and staff education process. We really recognized that we needed to build our core competencies around this area in order to be successful. We engaged with a consultant to help us and to support us in this process. We had a learning component, an MRI learning component in almost every agenda of our board meetings for 2 years. We also had sessions with our finance and our program staff. We also began with completing what we call the Know What You Own and Who Invests What We Own scan as a baseline. And after that, our board in 2017 approved an MRI carve-out of $50 million to be invested over 5 years. We released an RFP and engaged an MRI advisor. We selected Cambridge and Associates as our partner in implementing our mission investing portfolio. We set up our carve-out initially to mirror the asset allocation of our broader portfolio. And we did this to give us the ability to compare our MRI investment performance against the broader portfolio. And our strategy was really to very quickly deploy the $50 million in a range of liquid public equity and fixed income funds with fully integrated ESG strategies. And over time, our strategy then is to diversify those liquid assets into more private funds that are more closely aligned with our mission and that provide additional resources to our underserved communities. And also just overall, I just want to mention that, you know, at Cal Wellness, DEI is a core value throughout of everything that we do. So not only our mission related investing, but overall our portfolio is invested with that lens as well.
Thank you, Rochelle. And maybe we could move over to Mike.
Thank you. Well, I certainly agree with what Rochelle said. But first, by way of introduction, I have been in the impact investment business for approximately 18 years, having co-founded a firm called the Bay Area Equity Fund, which is now called DBL Partners. And so in the course of those 18 years, this has gone from being something that's considered really quite exotic to something that's become quite mainstream. And I'm very pleased to have the chance to contribute to those and to the consideration of those who want to use the entire corpus for social purpose consistent with the mission of their foundation or organization. Because after all, that is what, in my opinion, these public purpose organizations, particularly those with tax exempt status, are here to do. So the way to go about it, as Rochelle was saying, in my opinion, is to involve the board of the organization and or the investment committee, or better yet, both, with others who have done this for some time, by getting their peers to say, essentially, it's okay. It's understandable that you're nervous about trying to achieve market rates of return while doing social good. We were too when we started out, but here's how we have done it. And I think the more exposure that the groups of decision makers, whoever they are, have to the people they regard as their peers who have done this, the better. Secondly, it's important, I think, to measure, of course, we're in the habit of measuring the financial return, but it's just as important to measure the social return. Now, fortunately, many private equity and venture capital managers do that now. And then there's a bit of a controversy over, can we trust them to do it, or must we hire a third party to do it? As we do, for example, hire auditors to audit the financial performance of companies that we invest in. And one consideration is, how do we evaluate the social contribution of those to whom we make grants? Do we trust the information that they give us, or do we hire a third party to evaluate the success of the grants? And I would suggest that maybe we should apply the same standard to our impact managers. Next, I would say it makes sense to do what I consider to be the easier stuff first, and that is to move the public equity and debt portfolios from those who focus solely on financial return to those who are ESG oriented. And there's ample evidence that it costs one nothing to do that. In fact, as Tina points out in our recent discussion, recently ESG managers have had superior financial performance to those who don't consider those considerations. So I would start with that. That is what we did. And also then at the same time be interviewing private equity and or venture capital managers who are committed to making impact through their investments. The advantage of this category, of course, is that it's easier for managers to be proactive with company management to achieve certain social objectives, whatever they may be, than it is with large companies. Lastly, I would say making direct investments in companies is the riskiest, of course, because there's a lack of portfolio diversification, but it, of course, can also be the most directly applicable to the mission of a foundation or other organization. But it requires having in-house skills of people who are investors as well as evaluators of social contribution. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. But I think a little bit different, but I think we may have gotten past it now. So let's move over to Jeremy.
Great, thanks so much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's sometimes easiest to go last because I can very much relate to some of Michael's comments as well as Rochelle's. But I will admit, Michael, at least initially, to relating a little bit more to Rochelle, because we came at this also in 2016, must have been a good year, and very much from an educational and learning component. A little bit of background and geography. Probably many of you on the call are very familiar with community foundations, but we all have our own tools and probably local complexities and individualities. So just a minute on who we are and our background and our lines of business will be, I think, helpful to frame what I'll say next. We have been in the San Diego community for 53 years. We're the oldest community foundation in San Diego. We oversee around $500 million. And a quick overview of our three primary lines of business. Our core line of business, like probably most community foundations, is taking care of families. So we facilitate and support philanthropy for around 800 plus family units. And our second line of business is institutional. We also have a very active institutional business managing funds on behalf of or directly for something over 80 nonprofits here, specifically in the San Diego region. Most of those assets are endowment focused, but not all by any means. And then the third line of business is the traditional endowment business that we manage in-house, largely to benefit other organizations. We offer the overlay for all of that is we offer a pooled investment platform. So very much like your 401k, we offer all of our stakeholders equally, whether you're a $5,000 donor advised fund or $1 million symphony or other organization, we offer them access to the same platforms. So how do we bring that all together? And you can probably guess where I'm going with this. Back in 2016, the problems that we set out to solve were how we could invest in a way to better reflect our core values and specifically some of our faith-based values and put those together. Secondly, how could we bring more process to bear to avoid either headline risk in the negative, which is oftentimes what we look at in applying ESG screens, or in the positive to affect change. Thirdly, how we could facilitate both broader and more focused impact for our donors by leveraging their investment opportunities with the funds that we hold before they're eventually deployed in traditional grant making. So maybe not being quite as one-dimensional. Many people look at community foundations as a warehouse, or if you like, an analogy as a trust company, holding funds as a fiduciary just until we can turn into a grant maker and get those funds out to the community. So when you're sitting on some significant capital, how can you activate that capital in the meantime, presuming that it is eventually going to go out into the community and grant make it? And then last but not least, for us, this was all about our donors and probably the difference between us and obviously a single purpose foundation or a private foundation, a corporate foundation. We really see ourselves as the role as an honest broker. This was about our donors and partner orgs initially. We did not, unfortunately, unlike some community foundations, we did not have the capacity to make any JCF, Jewish Community Foundation, directed investing or decisions. So we had this balance of sort of top down, a feeling that we needed to be top down and certainly provide some value add in the space, learn about the space, but also very sensitive to the fact that we wanted to be demand led. We have clients. We had 800 donor clients, 80 organization clients. That journey went through some specialized committees, probably much like Rochelle's experience. We also hired a consultant. And I'll talk about this a little bit more later on. To Michael's point, which is really interesting, we did not take the easy route out. We did not apply an ESG screen to public equities. We talked about it. And I'm not going to be the spoiler alert for maybe some material coming later, but there's certainly a reflection in the rear view mirror. And we went the other route. We did form a discrete pool, a specialized impact investing pool that we felt would appeal to specific stakeholders within our group. And I think I'll just stop there at that point, and that was the beginning of our journey.
Got it. Thank you all for sharing some of those introductory comments and a little bit about how you got started. So, you know, they say hindsight is always 20/20. So our next question is related to what is the best advice that you never got as you started this journey? Michael, you shared some thoughts along those lines already, but maybe we'll take it the other way this time, and Jeremy, start with you.
Fair enough. Well, it's fresh in my mind. That's great. Thank you. So that's a good segue, actually. So yeah, I mean, looking back, I think it would have been to think even more about stakeholder engagement and communication. So we initially focused on bringing to market a brand new pool, which is or was intended and turned out to be a multi-asset class pool that would meet long-term and/or endowment-like objectives. So it could be a family looking to scope out multi-generational planning. It could be a traditional endowment. It could be an institution holding permanently restricted assets, any one of those. And we then, later in the journey, we pivoted to activating local place-based initiatives, joining with partnering local place-based initiatives, specifically here in San Diego, that we found out attracted a small number of very highly engaged donors. And then funnily enough, you know, reflecting again on Michael's thoughts, only now, and when I say now, literally in 2020, so 4 years later, are we turning our attention to selecting ESG managers for the existing portfolios and really working with our consultant, which is Mercer, to take that sort of top-down look at the legacy portfolios. It's worked out, I think, really well for us, but we have had a tougher time because our narrative for the last 3 years wasn't as broad as it could have been, and nor was the audience as broad as it could have been. So I think the advice we never got would have been to facilitate more stakeholder conversations and get more specific with those conversations about our planned strategies and their potential engagement of the stakeholders.
Interesting. I always think that it's fascinating. That is, you know, what seems really difficult and like the last thing that should be done to one organization is sort of the first place where another organization dives right in to get going, and vice versa. And I think it does speak to the unique, needing to take into account the unique organizational culture of any particular institution and figuring out what is best for that institution. So maybe Rochelle, moving now to you, maybe you could say a word as well about, as you kind of reflect on this process, the best advice you never got.
Best, yeah, yeah. Hindsight, always 2020. But you know, thinking about this a little bit, I think perhaps that maybe we wouldn't have pursued the carve-out approach. Especially, I think I mentioned earlier that we had a $50 million carve-out, but also our carve-out was you know, allocated to mirror the asset allocation of our broader portfolio, and to maintain the same risk-return profile. So while on one side, where it really did help create a level of comfort for the board that we are taking a baby step or putting our foot in the water, as a result, we do also have some great data, as Mike mentioned earlier, that ESG and mission-related investing funds are performing comparable, if not better, to investments in our broader portfolio. But having this carve out and mirroring it to the asset allocation has also been a little bit limiting for us, because it does impose limits on the investments and the investment opportunities moving into the private sector. So, you know, on the private side, it's really, we have not been able to make full allocations to the funds that we would normally make. So ultimately down the road, the goal is that we want to apply these principles to the entire endowment. And, you know, I can tell you we're already doing this with our advisor on our broader portfolio, that we are really moving towards aligning our entire portfolio with mission, as well as, you know, intentional investing in more diverse managers.
Excellent. And Michael, I know that you've already, in your introductory comments, sort of touched on some of the advice that you would offer, but want to also give you an opportunity to reflect on any advice that you never got, or the best advice you never got.
I guess the only thing that I can think to add is to remember that some people will never believe, despite whatever the current data is, that you can make as much money, you can make market rates of return while trying to do social good at the same time. I think that for some reason that it's just a non-starter. And so that's why I think it needs to be an emotional sale as much as a data-based sale. And if their peers are doing it, or people that whose judgment they're generally comfortable with, that's very helpful.
Yeah, I think that's actually very good advice, right? You have to know your audience, and you have to know what's going to resonate. And there is sort of a unique mix of data and story that has to come together to kind of get you across the finish line. And I think oftentimes folks think about getting across that finish line, sort of getting the approval, the board okay is sort of the big hurrah. But in reality, now that's just sort of the green light. Now you've got to actually make it happen. And so I think it'd be interesting to hear from you all some of the hurdles that you faced in actually executing your first investment. So once you sold your organization, you kind of went down this journey, and now you actually had to put it into practice. Could you speak to some of the challenges that you faced? And Michael, this time we'll start with you.
Okay, I'm happy to, and of course not meaning to impugn JP Morgan or any other traditional large-scale asset manager. When we told them we wanted to do this, they said, Well, that's great. You're the first among our client base to say you want to do this. So we're not sure that we're that well equipped to help you. So let us do some work and come back to you. So we did, and they did. And so that was ultimately, it's fine. And we've been very happy with our relationship with them. But I think that that is perhaps the reason that special purpose advisors, special purpose impact advisors are so useful, because of course, even though it is becoming a greater focus for the biggest financial institutions, it still is not their mainstream business. So anyway, just that point, I guess, that they would say we brought them along more than they brought us along.
Got it. And that's, we've heard that plenty of times. Rochelle, maybe moving back to you, what about in your experience? What were some of those hurdles you faced in that first investment?
Before I go to hurdles, I just wanted to bounce off of something, Michael said a little bit ago also about debunking that myth that you can't do social good, have investments and make money at the same time. I think a really big part of how we went about that is that education piece and that education journey, that we invested the time with our board and our staff to do that learning, to get past that myth, so we can, shift our thinking. And that kind of leads to my to a little bit of the hurdle is shifting that thinking. One, shifting the thinking that the endowment is solely there to make returns to support grant making, versus a tool that we can leverage to really and move all of our mission and support all of our communities and our goals and the values of the entire organization. So making that shift in thinking, not only at the board level, but at the entire organization level is what was key. And bringing, those board members and investment and our investment advisors along has been a key hurdle.
And Rochelle, maybe just following up on that, what do you think has been most effective in bringing your investment advisors along? Because we have heard, similar to what Michael was just saying, that at times working with one's existing investment advisors is one of the early hurdles or challenges, because they may not be familiar, they may not quite understand the field. So how did you get over that?
Well, I mean, we took a little bit of a different path in that when we started this journey in 2017, our investment advisors at the time were not all that familiar with the space. And so that's why we issued an RFP and hired a second advisor to support building out our carve-out and implementing our mission-related investing portfolio. So they only manage this $50 million carve-out. And so in that process, it's also brought along our our other advisor, and also and us pushing them along as well and saying, this is what we want, this is where we're going, these are our values, and the train has left the station, right? This is where we're going. We're not going backwards.
Yeah.
So I think, and getting them on board and comfortable with our mission and ESG and why it's important to us. And, we require on any investment now that comes to the investment committee, that they talk about the ESG and how it aligns, and if it aligns with our mission, even on our broader portfolio, as well as a very deep dive into diversity and equity, the diversity of the team that manages the funds.
Yeah, I just think that's a really important point, that the issue of the advisors, because they can really be sort of gatekeepers for the institution in their ability to move along. And I think there's just a variety of ways to tackle that. As Mike said, they sort of brought their advisor along with them. And in your
Yeah,
case, there was
they
sort of
do.
need to pair another advisor to help sort of unstick the process. And now that's bringing your initial advisor along. And in other cases we've heard of, folks have just altogether replaced their advisor. But I think that at times that can feel terrifying to organizations, that in order for me to do this work, I need to completely eliminate my existing advisor and go find a new one. That's a big hurdle. And the reality is that there are a lot of variations of ways to bring them along, pair them with somebody else, and still get to where you want to be. Jeremy, maybe you could tell us a little bit about, in your experience, some of the hurdles that you faced in executing your first investment.
Yeah, thanks, Tina. And many of these are certainly very relatable. But for us, I think that the initial hurdles were actually around our lay leaders and committees and boards activation and participation rather than the advisors. And we had, maybe like many of you, we had still have a very traditional investment committee in the initial sort of education effort altogether. And all of us, including me, needed to be educated. We got some pushback. In fact, specifically, a couple of the members, commented that they saw their role only to generate market returns and not around mission alignment, which is maybe just a subtle jig away from what my colleagues here have been talking about. Not just the discussion whether we can have market rate returns with mission alignment, but what is mission alignment, and should the investment committee be talking about it? And that may be very apparent to many of you on the call. But for us, we hadn't really fully thought out about, how we get that input from a governance standpoint, and how that overlays with or dovetails with the investment committee. So we had to work with the board, the investment committee, other stakeholders, other donors and committees that weren't used to being in this process, that maybe saw this as too technical, and then the technical people that saw this as a little bit too soft and fuzzy, and bring those people together around specific language. And that's really when we sort of hit a little bit of a wall, is working on those words and what those words said. And especially in the community foundation world, we don't have specific PRI or MRI language to rely on in the public foundation world. But funnily enough, I felt, and our general counsel felt, very comfortable with those guidelines. And we did end up with some very, very general PRI safe harbor language, not getting too specific, leaving open room for mission alignment to be a sort of a flexible and to be defined term. And just to wrap this back into Rochelle and Michael's thrust of their comments, we made it very, very clear that the pool we were planning to stand up, the impact investing pool, would be market rate. It would be measured by secular measures. It would conform to fiduciary standards for endowments here in California, MIFA, and all of the familiar secular measures that the consultants and our investment committee were comfortable. And then everything outside of that box, we would deal with separately in a below market rate PRI way, which I know, as Tina said, is not the thrust of today, but that was the way we could clear the space to talk about broader portfolio activation, is make it very clear what we were talking about. We did hire a consultant to help us, slightly different, specifically faith-based. So we had confidence that our existing consultant could educate us in the secular world, but we hired a thought leader who was terrific. And the two of them actually work very well now. They've been working together for 4 years, work very, very well together. Our consultant on the secular side, on the Pavilion Mercer side, has other Jewish foundations as clients, and it's been a very nice symbiotic relationship.
And Jeremy, you mentioned in your comments this this conversation that had to take place between, I think you described it as the more technical and less technical side. Others have described it as sort of the programmatic and the investment or finance side of the house, which is a nice segue into the final question that we wanted to touch on before we move over to the audience questions. So what were some of the unexpected moments that you had to face in communicating this strategy to stakeholders? I think, this communication that has to happen between these two different sides of typically of philanthropic organizations where you have, programmatic folks and finance folks who don't always speak the same language. And even when they're using the same words, they don't often mean the same things with the same words. And, that can sometimes lead to unexpected conversations. But were there other unexpected moments in this process for you in communicating this to your stakeholders? And who were those stakeholders that you had to have these sort of unexpected conversations with?
Sorry, Jane, would you like me to start on that? Or?
Yeah, please. Kick us off and then we'll move on.
Apologize, Tina, it cut out. Is that me? Okay, I'll jump in. Hopefully everyone can hear me. So yeah, this is a good way to circle back to beginning. And Michael's points about taking the easiest route, and I'll now reveal why we didn't do that. And it was because of some unexpected moments. So when we originally considered going the more traditional route and applying ESG screens to public markets, there were a couple of specific issues specific to us, central to us, that we felt might cause friction both with our Jewish and non-Jewish stakeholders. We have some pretty significant numbers of non-Jewish individual donors, family units, and organizations. And the first one was around, some of you might be familiar with the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, which calls for a boycott of Israeli and international companies that are complicit in violation of Palestinian rights. It's obviously a very political, highly charged topic. Might surprise some people on the call to know it's political and highly charged both within and outside of the Jewish community. By even participating in that discussion within the framework of our legacy pool system could lead to unnecessary friction, we felt, with some of our own stakeholders. So for example, our donor community, which is very well represented on both the right and left wings of the political spectrum, both here in the US and in Israel. And those are sometimes overlapping and sometimes not. So as they say, it's complicated. So that was unexpected moment number one that caused us to pivot towards a carve out and having a separate pool where we could build consensus, albeit among a smaller group of stakeholders. And the second one, pivoting to a more positive example, if you like, would be aspirational strategies to invest in specific faith-based and place-based initiatives. So one example was a group of donors approached us. We're very, very excited to work to advance startups in an Israeli incubator in a disadvantaged area. It was a great, and still is actually, an opportunity to affect positive economic and social change across a variety of spectrums of the population, religious and cultural. And it really excited those donors. And we realized that, that those types of strategies could belong either on the market base or below market base, market return or below market return, a part of the spectrum, either in our niche pool or in the donor's own donor advised fund. So we realized early on that was another, I think, affirmation that taking this concierge approach could really generate some excitement, stories we could leverage, and just help us build up some experience before maybe we tackled some larger, what could be seen as some difficult questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeremy. And maybe Rochelle, we'll go to you next. If you could tell us a little bit about some of your unexpected moments in communicating the strategy to your stakeholders.
Yeah, I think communication is key. I think unexpected, I can say, even in my own journey in learning, coming up on the finance side, when I came to Cal Wellness, I had not had any experience or exposure to mission investing before. So it was a learning journey for me as well. And I had to shift my thinking and come on board per se, with mission related investing. And I remember, having a conversation with one of our board members early on, where, just in a side conversation at an event, he said, "Oh, I know where you stand on this subject." And and then going on and talking a little bit more, I realized that he didn't know where I stood, because that's where I was not anymore. I had shifted, my thinking, and so I really had to be clear with him that no, this is where I am now, and I have shifted my thinking, and this was why. And so he looked at me and said, okay, let me think, okay. And then, went back, and, I can tell you that he's been one of our strongest supporters going forward. Our entire board has been extremely supportive. So I think, in that conversation, one is you can't assume where you think people stand, or their understanding of the mission related investing, and also just that communication piece, and going back to the education, right? That that communication gap was, we could effectively close that gap, because we had all this communication, all this learning, the learning journey that the board and the staff were on together.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I also think it's important to point out, what I'm hearing also is that there is a certain amount of sort of personal courage necessary also for folks within organizations to say, no, I've changed my thinking. I'm not where you think I am. And in fact, I've moved away from what you think, and you need to come with me. Come to where I am.
Yeah.
So, I think that's also really important for folks who are trying to move this process within their organizations. You're not always going to be in lockstep with your board members, and that's okay, especially when you've gone through the kind of educational process that you've talked about. You have that to kind of point to explain rationally how your thinking has evolved, and hopefully bring others along with you. Mike, maybe we will ask you to kind of tackle this last question before we move on to some questions from the audience, if you wouldn't mind.
No, not at all. I'll give it a try anyway. The thing that I think of most of all is that while we have decided to do only market rate of return impact investing, my personal belief and what that means is that we can invest in companies that do social good, but generally speaking, they can't be solely focused on serving underserved communities, because as a generalization, those companies don't provide market rates of return. So as we have invested and as we have talked and thought, I think some of us believe that we need to have a carve out of the carve out, if you will, for what is clearly mission related and not market rate of return, because these for-profit companies want to serve only the underserved. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that, because if we were to achieve any return above zero, that would be higher than the return achieved in a grant. So, and if we're achieving a social good, that is, after all, what the foundation exists for. So again, I think it's very important to agree on what it is you're pursuing, but even over time, it may need to evolve as you come to grips with, and again, that's only my personal interpretation of how to make market rate of return impact investments. Not everyone would agree with that, but that is a continuing discussion that we face.
Excellent. Well, I want to remind our participants that we welcome you to include questions in the chat box. And in the meantime, I'm going to take the first question that I see there. So we've got a question from the audience for our panelists, asking if you could speak more to what it means to work with diverse managers, why that's important, and how you all are going about doing that. And Jeremy, maybe we'll come back to you and start with you.
Well, thanks, Judy. That's a great question, and we certainly respect, like everyone, diversity is in the eye of the beholder, and Michael started to get into some different lines of thought. I mean, I think for us, and certainly I'll give a shout out to our CEO Beth Cyril. We've had a focus on women-owned businesses, both through loan funds, some disadvantaged women-owned businesses, and we've started with some specific projects here in San Diego, and then all the way up to 30,000 feet. Beth has encouraged the committee to look at diversity in general, but beyond just gender diversity. At the board level, many of you know there's been some great efforts at the legislative level here in California to advance board diversity. Beyond that, we still have a long ways to go, I think, in the conversation. As I mentioned, we're executing through a multi-asset pool, and without getting too deep into the asset allocation of that pool, we feel that we have enough. So there's many tools in the toolbox in that pool to affect change in a number of different ways, not just through diversity.
Excellent. Rochelle, do you want to touch on that next?
Sure. So, at Cal Wellness, I think I talked about DEI being integrated, throughout everything that we do. And we certainly look at that, including how we manage our endowment. We really recognize there's, systemic barriers related to race and gender that are quite persistent in the financial sector. And so, we have, in the beginning, we did who invests what we own scan, where we looked at the diversity of our existing investment managers. And at the time, back in 2015, we did not have a very diverse portfolio. And so we have embarked on this journey over the last 5 years, where we've been extremely intentional as we select investment managers, both our advisors on the broader portfolio as well as our MRI portfolio. We require diversity data when we look at any new investment. It's a pretty detailed breakdown between male, female, and ethnic diversity, as well as in the ownership of the organization and the investment team, as well as the entire team. And I can tell you our board looks at that very carefully before we make investment decisions. I also have any new investments that are brought forward by our advisors. I have a conversation with each of these managers. Part was about their investment and investment theses and the numbers and all of that. But part of the conversation is about how they approach diversity, equity within their firm, how they promote, hire, and retain women and people of color within their firm, and look to their policies and their procedures and what they're really doing. And I can tell you there's been at least 2 investments that were that our board, our investment committee, I myself was not comfortable moving forward to our investment committee because of the lack of even the acknowledgement that there was an issue to be thought about regarding diversity within their firm. So we recognize that not all firms, we're not looking for perfection here. We just want to have the conversation and also kind of learn a little bit about how they're approaching diversity within their organizations, knowing that, we don't expect everybody to be completely diverse. We just want to learn how to get there.
Yeah. Michael, is there anything that you might add from your perspective?
Just a little. I am the sole male on the board and the sole male among the staff as well. So we feel that we have excellent gender diversity, but we are not very diverse yet within our managers and advisors. And so that is an important factor that we will consider in our future investments.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe I might just add to this because we've been looking at this issue ourselves. And I think the data point, just for everyone's benefit, that I read was something like less than 2% of all, in the VC world in particular, less than 2% of all venture capital is managed by women and or people of color. And so obviously they represent more than 2% of the general population. And you can just imagine the opportunity that's being left on the table when you talk about, you know, the impetus, the driver behind all investing is diversification, right? Imagine all of that perspective, all of that experience, all of that diversity that's being left on the table and not being taken advantage of. So I think that there are, not only is it sort of a compelling, you know, it's the right thing to do, particularly, you know, if you really are trying to advance a racial justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda, but there are real financial reasons for doing it as well. Okay, so I'm moving back to, we have a couple more questions here. So what do you consider to be market rate in market rate return? Michael? Yeah,
sure.
jump
I'm happy
in.
to take a stab at that. So that is something that is only knowable in retrospect, you know, and that's why people talk about vintage funds. You know, for a fund that started in 2010, the market rate of return, let's say, was 16%, and if it started in 2005, let's say, it was 18%. I'm just making those numbers up, but you know, therefore one can't know that in advance. I think the important thing is whether or not the strategy is to invest with the expectation of making market rates of return, whatever that is, as distinct from a strategy of making concessionary rates of return, which is to say, if one, of course, everyone makes mistakes every day in terms of what the returns will be. But so it is the intention and the practice of seeking market rates of return.
Excellent. And maybe I'm going to go on to the next question just to fit in as many of these as possible. So we've got another question asking about, in the wake of COVID, what opportunities exist for investing in health equity? And maybe Rochelle, I don't know if that's something that Cal Wellness is particularly looking at in your strategy.
Yes, I mean, we have been looking at that, and I can tell you that our advisors on both sides of the portfolio have brought us, they're mostly in the private equity space, looking at investments that support telemedicine and, you know, technology related to medicine. That seems to be a large push right now, and we're seeing a lot of funds that are developing and or even we just invested in a fund that is you know, specific to COVID related technology that can then be beyond COVID.
Excellent. Well, we do have one more question, but in the interest of time, I'm going to leave it there because I want to make sure to pass it back over to Carlos, who's going to wrap up the conversation for us today. But want to really thank our panelists and the participants as well for the great questions. Thank you.
And thank you, Tina.
Thank
You did a
you.
wonderful job moderating. I want to echo Tina's note of gratitude to our speakers. Thank you for our participants for joining us. And also I want to thank, there's been a huge planning team a part of today's program, including RBC Global and the team, Catherine and her team, as well as the team at Mission Investors Exchange. So a huge shout out to everyone who made today happen. Very grateful. And my colleague Melissa is going to share with us an evaluation poll. If you could please take just a minute to respond to these questions. Again, this data is incredibly helpful for us at San Diego Grantmakers and our Alliance at Philanthropy California as we continue to improve our programs. So I want to thank you all again. The poll will be up. Feel free to take your time finishing that. And I just want to wish you all a beautiful day. Thank you.